When Michelle and I were a young couple, we had Brett was our first of our three children. When Brett was little, he was like 2 or 3 years of age. Michelle and I were one day at the mall in Maryville, Hobart, do some shopping or whatever we're doing with our little family. And we went to J.C. Penney, so Michelle was going to buy some outfits for herself. So we went to, Michelle was looking at some clothes, and I was doing what many, I would say men do, but I don't want to be too stereotypical, so many people like me would do. Whenever I walk into a clothing store, all the energy drains from my body. I'm like, oh, how long do I have to be here, So I'm muddling through, and I see there's some people who can relate to me today. I'm thankful. But anyhow, we were there, and, Michelle's just needed to get some outfits, and I'm watching Brett while she does, but we're already out shopping, so it was a good arrangement. So she's in there doing the process of, you go in there with a few outfits, you try them on, you come back out, throw them all on the side rack, and find a few more on the racks, and go back again, and I'm over there just waiting by the waiting room so she can come out once in a while and say, what do you think of this one? What do you think of that one? And I really have decided that they ought to invent a space outside of waiting rooms in these stores for husbands and boyfriends and stuff, to where they can put video game consoles and stuff, so that while you're waiting during the shopping, you can play something. That'd be a phenomenal idea, and if someone would invent that and install that, I will buy your stock in the company. But anyhow, so I'm there with little Brett. Michelle's trying on some clothes and in and out, and so as she's doing that, Brett, he's 2 or 3, and sometimes he wants to go back with her into the changing room because that's a new adventure, and sometimes he wants to stay out with me. And she's like, it's okay, he can come with me. So he'd go in with her, she'd come out to show me an outfit, he'd come out with her and stay with me the next time, and it was a back and forth game with Brett for the whole process. And at some point, he went back with her, and I'm waiting out there, and then she comes out and says, what do you think of this dress or whatever? And I said, great, where's Brett? And she says, what do you mean, where's Brett? He came out with you. I said, no, he went in with you. She said, no, he came out with you. And all of a sudden, we're like, trying to figure out what happened, and without getting into all the, who's he, what's he's there, apparently what we didn't realize, and I don't know if it's still this way in that particular changing room 20-some years later, but apparently, and this is, to me, this day, I don't know why this was designed this way. I'm used to people, there's like one entrance in, one entrance out. You can see, apparently there's another entrance on the other side of the changing room, and Brett came out from her, and instead of coming to me, he went the other way, and he was gone. And so we're in panic mode. We're running around the store. Brett, we're calling for him, terror setting in, all the emotions that come with that. And a few minutes later, we find him with a couple workers were there, and he's a little shy, so he's a little terrified as he's looking at these strangers who are kind of keeping him still, figuring out who he belongs to. And we are so relieved when they saw Brett was okay. We're so relieved. And then our relief turned to embarrassment because those 2 workers give us the judgmental, they give us the stank eye, And I'm just like, listen, man. Now listen, I almost want to say this. This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but let me just say this. Give parents a break, people. I mean, my goodness, dude, raising kids is tough, I mean, if you've never lost a kid or done something crazy along the way, you either never had kids or you're so perfect that we bow in your presence, but probably something else about you we could judge if we could scope out your life close enough, okay? But hey, listen, it happens. So we went through all the emotions of losing him and then finding him. And that's my story. I have 3 more stories if you want to hear the rest. But the point is, have you ever lost your child in a public place? No testimonies. You don't need to come up here and tell the details. But Zach is like, yes, I have. It's scary. And then it's embarrassing, right, at moments. It's a whole lot of emotions. Well, I bring that up because Mary and Joseph had a similar experience while raising their kids 2,000 years ago. And so, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that story today. Now, if you don't know what we're doing on Sundays here, let me just give you the overview. We are beginning a journey through the life of Jesus. And we started the journey back in December because we set up the birth of Jesus around Christmas time. But we're doing this journey, and today we come to our next story. And we're going to begin in Luke chapter 2. By the way, last week we saw, I was not here last week, but Anthony Curtis did a great job talking about the Herod the Great killing all the little children in Bethlehem under the age of 2 because he was trying to get rid of the new threat of this apparent king of the Jews that was born. And Jesus was a refugee that was rushed to with his parents to Egypt to survive the witch hunt. And then at some point, when Herod died and his son took over, they came back from Egypt, but they were afraid to go to Bethlehem because Bethlehem is too close to Jerusalem. And they went back to Nazareth. Nazareth is where Mary was from and where Joseph used to work, and they settled down there and raised their family. 10 years later is today's story in Luke chapter 2, beginning with verse 41. Ready? Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Now, the Passover festival would be the big holiday for Jewish people historically. They have many festivals and holidays, but Passover is the big one. Passover for the Jewish people is sort of like our Independence Day in the US of A on July 4th. Okay, it's their day when God brought them out of slavery in Egypt and delivered their nation, and so it's a day of celebrating God. It's religious, it's national, it's a big celebration. And those who could travel to Jerusalem, which used to be the capital city of the kingdom in its glory days, and is still the major city of Jewish life, even during this time of Roman rule. And those who could come to Jerusalem would come there for the feasts. Not everyone could travel because of distance or perhaps work responsibilities. But if they could come, they would come, fill up the city for the festival. And Jesus is going to come with his parents every year because they were devout. This was important in their religious and national traditions. So every year they would come down to Jerusalem. Now they lived in Nazareth, which is in Galilee. Galilee is north of the land of Judea. They would come out of Nazareth through Galilee, through Judea, to Jerusalem, and then back. And they would not come alone. It was never safe to travel alone, so people would travel in large groups. Perhaps Mary's parents would come. Mary's sisters and brothers and their spouses and their nieces and nephews would all come. Friends would come. And they would take a big entourage and travel together for safety and go to the festival, and then afterwards head back together to Nazareth. And this was an annual trip every year at this time. Well, it says in verse 42 that when Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual, which means that this was just another year of so many. But Luke, the author, points out this trip because this trip has a special event that we want to notice. And it takes place when Jesus is 12 years old. This is the only story that we have in the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus before he was 30 years old. There are other traditions and stories and legends out there floating around from old times. But the only story we have in the scripture canon about Jesus before the age of 30 is this one, other than his birth and the baby years that we saw last couple weeks. But he wasn't doing much then, he was a baby. So this is the first time you see his personality a little bit before he's 30 years old. So we're going to look at the story together today. Now, 12 years old is a big number. Some of you don't know this, but in Jewish culture, particularly several hundred years after the life of Jesus, they kind of officially formalized a ritual called bar mitzvah for boys or bat mitzvah for girls that started after the life of Jesus sometime, but the roots of the ideas were from ancient times. That these festivals would celebrate. For example, when a boy turned 13, his bar mitzvah, he would maybe read a little bit from the Torah in a religious setting and do certain things. They'd have a celebration of his age. Nowadays, it's turned into more of a secular event and parties, and and for girls, the bat mitzvah at age 12, and there's Netflix shows about that, I think. So there's all sorts of. It's a whole secular thing too now. But back in the old times, it was sort of a big deal at the age of 12 or 13, and Jesus' birth preceded those traditions, but the ideas were ancient in their culture because 12 or 13 was a special age range. Where a person was no longer a child, but they're not yet an adult. In Jewish culture, at age 20, they were considered to be fully autonomous adults. Like they could do certain things independently at 20 in their culture. Now, certain things you couldn't do. Now, once you turn 20, you could rent your own camel or something, I don't know. But you could do certain things. But before that point, you were just, you were a child still. You weren't a child, you weren't an adult. So you're in those in-between years. We've called them teenagers all my life, right? And I've been one. And so at 12 or 13, they would honor that through these celebrations. And so Jesus, back in those days, is around that age. He's 12 years old. He's not, like other kids, he's not a boy, but not yet a man, or as Brittany once sang, he's not a girl, not yet a woman, or whatever. He's in that in-between stage, heading towards adulthood. And the reason this is a big, big deal is because parents, and maybe this helps some of you to think about, or amuses you to think about, to that culture, hitting that age meant that the parents were no longer solely responsible for their children's decisions. When the children were younger than that, whatever they did wrong is all on the parents. The parents were fully responsible for their children. But when the child turned 12 or 13, well, they're old enough to know better. So we can hold them a little bit more accountable for their own decisions. But they're not an adult yet. They need to be an answer to their parents still, but we expect more from them. So it was a special age. And Jesus is at that age. He's 12 years old. He's going to the Passover festival like he does every single year, and that's where our story takes place. Verse 43. After the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth, but Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. Like, apparently I'm 12 now, I'm staying behind. So they're thinking, why would he stay behind? And why would his parents let him stay behind? Well, they didn't let him stay behind. They didn't know. Verse 44 tells us that his parents did not miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travelers. Now, this is where all the other stories that most of us can tell about losing kids would probably fit in. When you're ever traveling with a lot of other people and you're just in a big group and sharing, my kids are with you and your kids are with me, this is how things happen. There were a lot of travelers heading back towards Nazareth, and they don't know that Jesus is not in the group somewhere because they just thought he was somewhere, kind of like Kevin McAllister in Home Alone, You're rushing out the door, you're counting heads, and you think he's he's sleeping upstairs. This is like the new movie, Home Alone Part 17, Lost in Jerusalem or something, I don't know. But anyhow, so they're all trying to go home, and Jesus is not with them. But they don't know it yet. They figure he's with his aunts or uncles, playing with his cousins in another group, or maybe with some friends somewhere. They don't think he's missing. They're just heading back. But when he did not show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. So I don't know what the evening triggered. Maybe it was bedtime. Maybe it was dinner time. They're like, okay, everyone get some food. Got to feed our own. Who's missing? Where's Jesus? Anyone seen Jesus? James, go find Jesus. Go to your cousins and see if he's over there. He's got to be somewhere. Tell him it's time to eat. What's wrong with that boy? And so then they come back and, hey, we can't find him anywhere. Now everyone's searching. Has anyone seen Jesus? No, he's not with any of us. And that's when the panic begins to set in. It says in verse 45 that when they could not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there because they couldn't have lost him he's not with a family and he wouldn't have lost him on the trip, so he must have been left in the city. Yikes. So they're going to go back to Jerusalem to search for him. 3 days later, I'm going to just pause there for a few moments. That's terrifying. 3 days. Look, I told you a story of losing Brett for a few moments. I have a story with Jessica too, but I won't get into all my stories, so you won't judge me. But here's the thing. When you lose your kid for a few minutes, it feels like a long time, it's like you have enough time to plan their funeral, to beat yourself up over. It seems like forever. 3 days later, folks, 3 days they couldn't find Jesus. Can you imagine all the emotions? We lost him. What do we tell God, we lost him. So 3 days later, they're like, imagine going to bed at night trying to get a little rest and you're on your pillow and you're crying tears and saying, what kind of a parent am I? I hope he's okay. Is he safe? I wonder, waking up the next morning in a panic thinking, oh no, it wasn't just a bad dream. It's real. We got to go out and find him. 3 days go by. 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple, sitting among the religious teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Now, maybe you're sitting here today with me and wondering, well, why didn't they find him there? Why didn't they search for him there sooner and find him there sooner? And if that's your question, good news that Jesus will ask the same question himself later on. But here's the thing. I want to defend them for a moment. I want to just defend them. Because they're looking everywhere. And probably they didn't want to go in. Remember, the temple's a big place. The temple that Solomon originally built, that was destroyed and rebuilt years later, had been expanded to outer courts for different groups of people, like the court of the women, court of the Gentiles. And then those courts were expanded even more. And then Herod came along and built a greater complex known as Herod's temple, which could fit 100,000 plus people. And so there's a lot of parts to the temple. And you probably, when you're going back there, you don't expect you're going to find your 12-year-old missing son. You're not going to go bother the room full of important men sitting around having religious discussions and political discussions. And, that's their thing. So you're just going to I'm not going to interrupt. I'm not going to embarrass myself by telling them that we lost our kid. They got more important things to bicker about. So they're looking everywhere in the temple complex, the greater temple complex, the city of Jerusalem. 3 days go by. And they finally decide, I'm going to go interrupt the meeting. I'm going to interrupt the gathering of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the scribes or whoever's all discussing their ideas. And I hate to do it, but at some point you're desperate. Excuse me, sir, have you seen my son? We lost him. When? 3 days ago, So they walk into the gathering, and there they find Jesus sitting there, listening. A 12-year-old boy sitting in a religious place listening. What kid is this, man? He's intrigued, and he's asking questions. And they're shocked. In fact, it says in the next verse that all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Now, that's a remarkable statement. Remember, and I think we forget this sometimes, remember that in ancient times, people were not as literate as we are today. We sometimes assume that everyone is like it is now. But the illiteracy rate was super high. About 10% or less of people at that time were literate. Because most people lived in rural areas. Staying alive and feeding yourself was a day-by-day job. I mean, and to stop and teach your kids yourself when you got to eke out an existence was hard to do. The more remote you are, the harder it is to find a group to do it. If you were in a city, you could afford perhaps to have people assigned to educate. So the cities had higher literacy rates than the rural areas or small towns did. And the Pharisees had been expanding schools of education all over the country to teach the law, the scriptures to people. So it was getting better, but a lot of folks didn't read. And the ones who did have the access to education, the privileged ones, the best and the brightest of them would sometimes get the chance when they became 12 or 13 years old to have a mentorship where they could sit at the feet of a rabbi and learn the deeper things and maybe become a political person or a religious person someday in their adulthood. But that's for the few. Here's Jesus. He's not from Jerusalem. He's an out-of-town kid in there for the Passover festival, staying behind, and he's blowing everyone away because he's asking good questions. And when it says he's understanding, the idea is that there's two kinds of questions. There's good questions, and then there's, whenever your teacher once said there are no such thing as dumb questions, they were lying to you. There are some dumb questions out there. You're like, when some people, you ask a certain question, you're like, okay. Anybody else? But when someone asks a good question, you're like, okay, they understand what's going on here. Their question shows that they understand. And he's listening, he's asking, he's answering things, and he's 12, and everyone's blown away. Who is this kid? His parents didn't know what to think. I mean, they've been panicking for 3 days. They imagined, like I'm sure some of you do when you lose someone, they pictured visiting him at the morgue or something, they don't know where he's at. And there he is, alive and well, having a conversation with all these people like he's some genius, young savant or something. And they're looking at him thinking, what is happening here? Son, his mother said to him, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere. Okay, If you ever lost a child, I know some of you amazing people cannot relate. If you ever lost a child, a lot of emotions go on, from fear and worry to relief and embarrassment to anger. Like at some point you're like, God, please help them not be dead. Oh, good, they're alive, they're not dead. Now I'm going to kill them. I'm just going to kill them, And so, at some point they're relieved and that he's there. They're like, why have you done this to us? I mean, excuse me, been in this important religious meeting. Sorry to interrupt your important gathering. Jesus, could you come here, please? Come over here. Okay, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been worried sick about you. And look what Jesus says to them. But why? Why did you need to search, he asked. Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house? Now, that's an interesting statement from Jesus, and don't think he's being snotty to his parents. He's not. He's doing what Jesus was already doing. He was sitting amongst the religious teachers asking questions. He's asking questions to his parents. This is a tool. This right here is a tool that Jesus would use his entire life. If you don't know this already, come back in a few weeks as we go through the New Testament. Adult Jesus oftentimes would get confronted by people who would ask him hard questions, and one of his favorite techniques was he would answer their question with another question. Let me answer that question with a question. Which, by the way, something my teachers never let me do in school. I always wish I could do that. Arlen, what's 2 + 2? Let me answer that question with another question. If a woodchuck could chuck wood, anyhow. But no, I mean, it's nice to divert, but Jesus oftentimes would answer questions with questions because the questions that he would ask would produce their own answers. And so here he is, and his parents are like, why have you done this to us? We've been worried about you. And Jesus is like, why were you searching so far? Didn't you know I'd be here in my Father's house? Some of your older translations would say, doing my Father's business. Didn't you know I'd be here of all places? Why were you searching? And what he was saying to them was, look, I know who I am. In fact, the phrase, I must be in my Father's house, was very intentional. Because you see, Mary had just said to him, your father and I have been worried sick about you, referring to Joseph. Now, Joseph was not Jesus' biological father, was he? We learned that in the Christmas story. Joseph was Jesus' stepfather. But that does not mean that Mary misspoke, because Joseph was his father. Come on now. Some stepfathers and stepmothers you're the parent, you're the father and mother, right? I mean, some stepfathers and mothers are better parents than their real fathers and mothers are, right? I mean, Joseph was a father to him, and no doubt through his entire life, he called him dad, and this was not like Mary misspoke. She was right when she said, your father and I have been worried sick about you. But Jesus was saying to her, I know, Mom, Dad, I know, but I also know who I am. And you know who I am, Mom, you know, virgin birth, that's pretty unforgettable. Dad, you had the angel visit you. I know whose I am. So I'm in my Father's house. He's basically letting them know things are coming together. And that's interesting. It's an interesting answer. It says, but they did not understand what he meant. Well, at least not at the time. They were probably too panicked still. Oh, good, he's alive. Don't ever do that to us again. They didn't understand what he meant. I love this verse 51. Then he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And I think that's pretty noteworthy. Anytime you can talk about a 12-year-old boy going back and being obedient to his parents, that's a challenge. I'm not speaking for all young people or teenagers, as we would say, but I know when I was a teenager, sometimes it was hard to be obedient to my parents. You know why? Because I was pretty sure I knew more than them in my defense, right? You ever been there, they're nice, but they're a little older. Now, when we're little, our parents are awesome. My dad's the strongest man, or my mom's the most amazing person. And then you get older and you think they lose their head. They lost their brains in the middle of the night. And you're embarrassed, So at some point, I'm like, they don't understand why I should go to this party. They don't understand why I should be allowed to, I'm just so smart now. So now if you're there raising a child and you feel like they used to think I'm awesome, now that they think I'm a humiliating embarrassment to their life, I'm a stain to their existence. If that's your experience as a parent right now, good news, it won't last forever. Someday they'll grow up, have their own kids, figure out you were, just hang in there, okay? Don't take it personal. But I was a teenager, I knew it all. And so sometimes you think I'm right. But technology doesn't help either, right? The more technology we have, The younger we are, the faster we grab onto it, which makes the people who are older seem that much dumber because they can't figure it out. So it's easy to get this mindset like, I know better and you're wrong. So here's what I want to say about this verse that amazes me, because I was there, okay? I was young. Here's what I want to say that's amazing about Jesus. If any 12-year-old or any young person ever truly did know more than their parents, it was Jesus, okay? If anyone could say, I'm right and you're wrong, I know more than you do, it would be Jesus. And yet he still goes back and is obedient to them. In other words, he still understands the relational dynamic. He still understands the journey he's on. He's like, this is the right thing to do to honor my parents and honor the stage of life I'm in, even though I'm Jesus. So I think that's impressive right there about him. It says, and his mother stored all these things in her heart. Now, if you've been with us the last couple of weeks, you've seen that sentence more than once, haven't you? Do you remember? Can anyone remember right now another time where we saw, another event where we saw a statement similar to that to the last couple of weeks? Anyone want to take a guess in the story? I shouldn't put you in the spot like this. No one wants to raise their hand, and I'm going to feel like no one listened anyhow. Yes. Yes, at Jesus' birth, when the shepherds came by and saw the baby, right? And she was like so astounded that she says that Mary pondered these things in her heart and kept them there. There's one other. It was when Jesus was at his baby dedication time. And Simeon and Anna are coming in and making a big fuss about their baby in the temple. And Mary pondered these things in her heart. And now we have a third time where Mary saw what just happened to her 12-year-old son, and she ponders it and she stores it in her heart. And I think the reason that's interesting is because Luke is the author. And remember that Luke was a physician who became a Jesus follower, and then he became a historian, and he wrote the history of the early church, and he went back and he interviewed all the people who knew Jesus or saw Jesus, got the stories, cross-referenced them, and wrote a biography of the life of Jesus. And at some point, he's talking to Mary, apparently, and Mary's telling him stories. Oh, I remember when he was born. I remember his baby daddy. I remember when he was 12 years old. She stored them in her heart, and she passed them on to Luke, who wrote them down for you and me to read about today, 2,000 years later. One more verse, and then we're going to talk about it for a little bit. Verse 52 says this: Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. That's a really powerful verse. I want to take a few minutes to talk about it. That's a powerful verse. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and all the people. What is that talking about? Well, honestly, if we wanted to sit down and make a big circle of chairs and just talk about this verse and really dig into the depths of it, we could spend hours and barely scratch the surface. There's so many thoughts that come to mind. For example, Jesus grew in stature. That means he grew up. We understand he was born as a baby. He had to grow up to be a 30-year-old man doing miracles. He grew up in stature. That makes sense. But sometimes we don't think about Jesus growing in wisdom. Wisdom, it's like getting knowledge from learning. You learn things, you get knowledge, and then you learn how to apply. You have the understanding to apply that knowledge to life. That's wisdom. Jesus had to grow in wisdom. Well, isn't he Jesus? Didn't he always have all that? And in favor with God? How do you grow in favor with God? He's Jesus. Like, wasn't that always like how do you grow in favor? Wasn't he always like perfectly in favor with God? How does he grow in that area? And growing in favor with all the people? It's weird, but it's not weird. It's just something we don't think about because we just think about him growing up. We don't think about all the other stuff. But it makes sense, doesn't it? None of us think that just because Jesus was God in a bod, we don't suppose that the baby in a manger was like fully, like none of us think that 3 weeks old Jesus stood up in the crib and said, "Hey, Mom, mess the diaper, come change me. You know what? Never mind, I'll do it myself." All right, we don't think that's how that went down. We all assume that he was nursed and he had to learn to walk and stumble and get up, and he had to grow up and he had to grow smarter and he had to learn things and he had to grow physically, mentally, in wisdom. He grew spiritually. That seems weird. In favor with God, he grew. And in favor with all the people. That means relationally, because growing up and learning how to deal with people. You ever had to deal with people before? That's the work, right? You got to grow in that area, figure it out. And Jesus grew in all these areas. He was well-rounded as an individual. Now, there are so many directions we can go with that thought for the next long time. But instead, I want to just focus on one direction today. Just one direction, not the singing group, just my point. I want to focus on one, I want to take one path here, and that is this. It's New Year's, pretty much New Year's. I know it's not the first Sunday of the new year, but I was gone last Sunday still, so my first Sunday speaking. So let me just say this from this story. There's always room to grow. This is what I want to leave you with today. There's always room to grow. All of us. And that's not something I'm saying to people who are younger than you. No matter how old you are in this room, that's for you. There's always room to grow. No matter what our age is, we all grow. When we're young, we learn things about in school and about life. When we become adults, we learn how to do a profession and learn a skill set. When we fall in love, we learn how to have a relationship. When we get married, we learn how to be married to somebody 24/7 for the years to come. When you have kids, you learn how to keep an infant alive and keep a toddler alive. When you have teenagers, you try to figure out if you want to keep your teenagers. You figure out how to raise a teenager. When your kids become adults, you learn how to let go and have an empty nest and grieve that process of your whole world changing. You figure out how to retire. You figure out how to make it. You figure out how to take care of your body as it changes over time. You figure out eventually someday how to face death in a way that honors and glorifies God. We grow our whole lives. We should. And so no matter how old you are, if we're still here, there's room to grow. By the way, the day you stop growing is the day you start dying. We should always be growing. And I want to point this out because whether or not you're a Jesus follower right now, whether you believe that or not, doesn't matter. This is good advice for all of us, no matter where I'm at in my journey. There's room to grow for me, for you, right? There's room to grow. But especially if you're a Jesus follower. The idea is that we follow Jesus. And you know what Jesus did? He grew. If Jesus, the Son of God, can grow, I probably could admit I have room to grow as well. When you're young, I always worry when I hear someone say, oh, I got it all figured out. Let me tell you something. Most of you can relate to me. When I was 13, I remember as a 13-year-old boy thinking back and thinking to myself, man, I was dumb when I was 9. But now that I'm 13, I got it all figured out. And then when I was like 17, I'm like, man, I was really kind of dumb when I was 13. But now I've got life figured out pretty good because I'm 17 now, you know what I'm saying? I got it all, the answers. And then I'm 25, I'm like, well, I didn't know nothing when I was 17. This keeps going. I'm 51 now. I'm looking back to my mid-40s saying, I didn't know so much. You know, that should be the case, that we're growing. We're growing in every area of our lives and never stop growing. Even Jesus, you know, it's interesting. We see him at 12 years of age. He knows who he is. We don't see him again until he's 30. But what we know about him in the middle is he grew. Physically, mentally, spiritually, and relationally, Jesus grew. So here's the question I want to ask you as we enter this new year. Ask yourself this: where do I need to grow? That's the question. Where do I need to grow? Maybe there's an area of every part of your life in which you need to grow. Or maybe there's just one particular area that you need to focus on. Where do I need to grow? Physically, at some point we stop growing up physically, we grow out physically. Maybe physical growth for some of us means I need to take better care of my body, my physical health with what God gave me. My diet, my exercise, how I treat myself. Do I need to grow in my physical care? Maybe it's mental. Do I need to learn? Is it time for me to learn something new? Yes, at my age, how to do a new life skill I've never learned before, how to broaden my horizons, how to figure something new out, how to challenge my presuppositions of what I think everything's about, how to challenge my beliefs and my religious and political beliefs, be uncomfortable with exploring different ideas and what do we say, exploring the frontiers of our own ignorance. Where do I need to grow mentally, physically? Spiritually, do I need to grow this year? Is it time to start each week like this, giving God the first part and growing in my faith, reading the scriptures on my own, praying during the week, finding a way to serve the kingdom of God and get busy serving in some way, something bigger than myself, giving, whatever it may be. Where do I need to grow spiritually? Where do I need to grow relationally? Is with my spouse or partner, with my children, with my parents, with my people I work for, people I work with, people who work for me, my neighbors, my friends? Do I need to grow in my relationships? Because here's the thing about me and you. I'll say me for your sake. If I have relationship issues everywhere I turn, like I have relationship issues here with that person and this family member and that person at work and that person in my friend circle, and I have all these relationship issues everywhere I turn, at some point I need to be honest and say, you know what the common denominator is in all those things? Me. Maybe I need to grow. Maybe there's something about me that could do better. Where do I need to grow in some part of my life? And so I want you to ask that question as we enter 2025. And not because of New Year's resolutions, because those don't always last, but where do I need to grow, not just for a day or two, but for the future? Now, I have two other questions to add to that one that are not going to be on the screen. After you decide where do I need to grow, the next question to ask yourself is this: how? How? Because if you don't ask how I'm going to grow, then what you're going to do instead is you're going to say, it's like looking in the mirror saying, I should probably get that food out from between my two teeth, and then forgetting to do it and walking away. So where do I need to grow? And then how? If you don't know how to grow in that area physically or mentally or spiritually or relationally, find someone that you respect and know, or research it, read a book, go online, or find somebody that you trust. I was just running through this sermon yesterday, one last practice run. And when I left here, I went to Strax next door to get some things before the football games, because God bless the NFL, you know. So I'm heading over there to get something. And as I'm in the store, I run into a man I know from a friend of mine, Phil Needler, and he's in the section there, and we're talking. And I was reminded of how he's a physical fitness trainer. And he trains people. He eats healthy. He's in great shape. He's in his 40s and he's in peak physical condition. And he's helped us through the years. And I'm talking to him, thinking, that's the kind of person you got to find when you don't know how to make yourself better. Find someone and say, hey, Phil, or somebody, what can I do to get better? Now, to be fully transparent with you, he was bringing these cartons of lean milk and stuff with him. And I was heading over to the donut section at the time, so don't judge me. I felt very self-conscious. But anyhow, the point is where do I need to grow? Physically, find someone who's doing it and saying, where do I start? How? If you want to grow mentally, find people who have expounded their knowledge and say, how do I do that? If you want to grow spiritually, find someone that you believe is spiritually healthy and say, hey, I want to grow spiritually. How can I start? If you want to grow relationally, find people who are rocking their relationships and say, hey, I'm trying to get better in my relationships. What can you tell me? How do I get started? But don't just ask, where do I need to grow? Ask how. Find a plan and put it in action. I have one last idea. Don't get discouraged with the progress. Most of us get discouraged so easily. It's like New Year's resolutions, right? How many people make New Year's resolutions and by about now, it's over. It's right. It's over. People they get a gym membership, and then we intensely work out for 3 days, and then we get sick from overworking out, and then we quit the gym. And so here, let me tell you a little secret about life. Most of us think that any part of our life, physically, mentally, relationally, spiritually, we think growth should always be up and to the right. Like when I start growing, I should see measurable, steady progress up and to the right. That's what we think should happen. But what actually happens with almost any kind of growth is more like an exponential growth curve. It looks like this. You grow, but you see no progress, and you see a little progress, and eventually it curves up. Then you see eventually ridiculous progress and the exponential growth curve. But because we expect it to go steadily up and to the right, that slow growth like this is very disappointing for a while. Now, in the end, you'll grow more than you ever thought you could, but for a while, it feels like you're underperforming. People are like, man, I've worked out for 4 weeks, and I don't feel like I got myself a Hollywood body yet. Or I try to make that relationship better for 3 weeks, and that person's still difficult. I'm done trying. You know what I'm saying? We just quit. because we don't see the payoff fast, because that curve tends to underperform its performance for a while, what we expect. But in the long run, it will outperform our expectations. But that middle ground, this is a whole science to this. There's a whole science. That middle ground of that lack of visible progress, they call that the valley of disappointment, or the trough of disappointment, where we're very disappointed with our results, and so we think, it ain't working, I'm done. But if we stick with it long enough, the results will blow us away. In fact, someone once said that most of us tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in a year, and we drastically underestimate what we can accomplish in 10 years. We think that we should be faster results now, so we look for them, and if we don't get them, we quit in the valley of disappointment. But if we were to stick with it long enough, we'd be surprised to look back and see how far we've come. So the key is to look 10 years ahead and say, I want to look back and say, I'm glad I did some things. There's obvious progress. I don't want to look at somebody else and say, I wish I did like they did. I'm just going to make sure that I stay on a track of growth and not get discouraged with temporary lack of results that are measurable. That's just how life works. So here's the question for your new year. Where do I need to grow? And then how? And then don't get discouraged. If along the way you're trying to grow and add some new habits in your life and you stumble, here's a little life hack for you. This is a bonus. I didn't give this to the 9 o'clock hour, so you're getting an extra. Okay, so here's a little life hack for you. If you ever stumble in trying to establish a new habit, it takes about 30 days to get a new habit pretty consistent. It's funny how it's easier to start a bad habit than to start a good habit, and how it's easier to stop a good habit than it is to stop a bad habit. Isn't that funny? But anyhow, here's the thing. If you're ever going along trying to grow as a person and you miss your target, you don't do what you're supposed to do one day, the secret is don't miss 2 days in a row. If you fall, you fall. Get back up immediately and don't fall twice in a row. You'll miss along the way, but the key is consistently getting back after it and grow. Where do I need to grow? How do I grow? And don't get discouraged because it takes time. Now, that's my little pitch for you as we enter this new year. I told you a story about Jesus at the age of 12. The only story about Jesus that we know with his personality showing prior to the age of 30. There's other legends that you can find, but you don't know how trustworthy they are. But this is the one in Scripture. And it tells us don't lose your kids in a crowd, right? That's a good lesson right there. Don't lose your kids in a crowd, unless you want to, which is another story. But hey, don't lose your kids. But besides that, the question today is, where do I need to grow? How do I do it? And then don't get discouraged along the way. We'll pick up our story next week as we continue the life of Jesus.